She came via her PhD at CMU and a postdoc at AI2. Her lab is the Dill Lab, and I really admire her deep look at both data and models and really understanding how they work instead of just letting things be as they are, that sort of incisiveness. So I'm really excited to hear her talk on understanding LLMs through their generative behavior successes and shortcomings. Big welcome. Thanks, Swabha, for giving your talk.
Thanks so much, Jay. And I'm so excited to be here at ISI finally, after 2 years of being at USC, which is not something I'm so proud of, but we're changing that. If you've been following what's going on in the world, every day or every week, we see the emergence of a new language model. All of these language models must be familiar to the folks in the audience. In this big explosion of a variety of language models, there is a lot that we don't know, but there are two things that are more or less clear and established as the research norms. One is that scale in terms of the number of parameters matters, and scale in terms of training data matters. So as a result, people who have the ability to scale up their models, scale up their data, tend to have this advantage in building the next generation of better and better language models. So what should we do? Should we just pack our bags and go home? Is this all that can be done to improve language models? Is it just scale and nothing else? Well, it's not that simple. Obviously, there are still things that could be done outside of looking at scale that can result in better and better language models. So we really need to understand what these language models are in order to improve them. And that's what my talk will focus on. So this concept of understanding language models can be approached in two ways, as I will address in this talk. One is through understanding the language model mechanism and design. We are going to take apart some of their design and look at what's happening much more closely and try to understand what's happening in the language models based on their design. And the second aspect of understanding language models is through their behavior. And to look at their behavior, the one essential thing that I will talk about is looking at the behavior in comparison to human behavior on a variety of different tasks. And in understanding language models' behavior versus human behavior on a wide variety of tasks gives us an idea of what their strengths and weaknesses are, and where we can improve them, where we can apply them, and so on. Okay, so my talk will focus on these two ways in which we can understand language models, and I will give you a brief overview of research projects that have been going on in my lab so far that touch on these two types of understanding of language models. So looking at the very first type of understanding, we will look at their mechanisms. This is sometimes called a mechanistic interpretation of language models. And this is work that will be presented shortly at ICLR and is led by my PhD student, Matt Finlayson, who was here last week and gave a talk on a follow-up project. So in this work, what we started looking at is modern sampling for generation. So you may be familiar with this. This is the overview of truncation sampling, where we choose some kind of a threshold tau, and tau is a probability, and only sample tokens with probability greater than tau. So you might be familiar with things like nucleus sampling or top K sampling, or even temperature sampling, which are combined with these kinds of threshold sampling. So in our work, we show that threshold sampling is guaranteed to work, and guaranteed to work in the sense that it is guaranteed to sample tokens in the support of the true distribution, as long as a large enough threshold is chosen. And by large enough, I mean that larger than some bound. Of course, you can choose like a very high bound, and that doesn't seem to work. But usually the greedy sample is usually in the true support of the distribution. And by the true distribution, we mean the distribution that we see in human written text on the web and so on. Okay, so this is saying something about threshold sampling. The next question we ask is what causes these errors that happen in the tail, these tail errors that truncation sampling can avoid. So to understand why we need something like truncation, we looked more carefully at how language models assign probabilities to tokens. And the one thing that helped us with this is this key result from multiple years ago, where they showed that language models by design are low rank approximations of the true distribution. So the reason this happens is that in language models, you typically use hidden representations, which are reals in dimension D, and then we project it to the size of the vocabulary, which is typically much, much larger than D. D, even for the largest models, are like a few thousands. We use a dimension in a couple of thousands, but the vocabulary is many, many thousands of tokens. So when we project this from a low dimension to this higher dimension, we end up with a low rank approximation of the true distribution. And then we project it down to a softmax. So you are in this nice probability simplex. So you can assign probabilities to different tokens, which we then use for sampling. So this low rank nature contributes to something called a softmax bottleneck, which folks at CMU talked about a few years back. And owing to this softmax bottleneck, we show that there will always be some error in the model's log probability estimation. So the model will never be able to exactly reproduce the true probability distribution. But regardless, language models still seem to perform well through this truncation sampling. So our hypothesis is that the truncation sampling is sufficient to avoid these errors that result due to the softmax bottleneck. Or in other words, if the error happens due to the softmax bottleneck, our truncation sampling can avoid those errors and seems to work very well in practice. Now, if the errors happen due to something else, that's not the case we cover. We are covering only the cases where the softmax bottleneck is causing the errors. So, okay. This is telling us something about the language models, but what next? So the next thing that we went about to do is that understanding this key feature of language models, the fact that they are low rank, leads to better sampling algorithms. So we propose a more direct method for mitigating the errors due to a softmax bottleneck. And the way we do this is we only select tokens which are very likely to be in the support of the true distribution. So what this results in are distributions like this, where in blue I've shown the tokens that our decoding algorithm would accept, and in red we have shown those tokens which are not accepted by ours. And you see this non-monotonic nature of our sampling. So sometimes it's not that we reject everything that is below a certain threshold. Sometimes we accept tokens which have lower probabilities and can be provably shown to be in the true distribution or in the support of the true distribution. And we obviously always include the tokens which are above a certain probability, but it's not just that the probability is the determining factor, it is whether or not it is likely to be in the true distribution that is the determining factor in our sampling method. So we call this basis-aware truncation sampling or BAT sampling. It's not the fastest method. It is not something that can replace existing sampling approaches, because for every token, we have to run a simple linear program. And we tried lots of methods to make it fast. It's not an entirely a scalable, efficient solution. But the bigger thing that we tried to show here is that understanding something about these language models can help us pave this path towards better algorithms. So these kinds of mechanistic understanding of language models leads to better algorithms or models. Okay, so that's the first part of understanding language models. We have been working on a lot of newer ideas in the space, which are too early to be included in this talk, but hopefully soon enough we can share some more results in that space. But the rest of my talk will be in understanding language models through their behaviors, and especially how their behaviors contrast with those of humans. Okay, so in this space, there are three different kinds of tasks I will talk about. One is a knowledge-oriented style of tasks. Then there are language-oriented tasks where we look at something about language itself to understand how language models process them. And the third category of tasks are societally oriented, where we look at how language models process social behavior. So let's look at the first category, understanding language models through their behaviors on knowledge-oriented tasks. And I'll talk about this work called neurocomparatives, which will be presented at NACL in a couple of months. Oh, by the way, feel free to ask any questions at any time. I'm more than happy to take questions. All right. So comparative knowledge is a very essential way in which we humans process the world. We don't just learn about new concepts in isolation. We learn about concepts in comparison to other related concepts that we are aware of. So it is a very crucial way in which humans acquire knowledge. And this is true for, very trivially true for those of you who have interacted with small kids, and kids will always draw comparisons between objects to try to understand new ideas. So to give you a very simple example of what this kind of a question might be is compared to blenders, food processors, I always forget which is which, but turns out there is a very important difference. If I ask GPT-4, it will tell me things like, and I ask it to be very brief, it will tell me things like have slightly different functions, have more versatility in the foods they can handle. And this is about food processors, right? So have several different functions. It tends to repeat itself a little bit. We also tried this other approach where we take a smaller language model like GPT-2 and do some fancy constrained decoding and then some rigorous overgeneration and filtering on top of it. And we get answers such as typically need a longer time to process food, can often handle more ingredients, blah, blah, blah. So these kinds of comparative common sense knowledge is somewhat an understudied aspect of common sense knowledge. I know a lot of folks at ISI have worked on common sense knowledge acquisition, and we wanted to focus on how we can use these language models to acquire common sense. So we came up with this somewhat complex pipeline to produce this largest available corpus of comparatives using language models, a mixture of small and large language models. I won't go into the details of all the things we did, but it's a fairly non-trivial task because you don't want to just prompt a language model with any two entities. You want to ask good questions in order to collect good, knowledge triplets and so on. All right, so how do we do compared to humans? So here we do a human evaluation for the kind of comparatives that you can find on the web versus those we found from our method and those that have been manually collected in existing resources. And the way we do this human evaluation is we show two different types of common sense knowledge for comparative knowledge and ask for ratings, which is an acceptable thing to say about a particular comparison. And here we see that compared to web retrievals, our collection seems to be of much higher human acceptance ratings and almost reaches the level of manual comparatives, which have been carefully collected in Atomic, ConceptNet, and so on. So that's great. Language models can achieve pretty much the same quality. What about diversity? So here we look at self-blue, lower is better, and we see that compared to humans, language models can actually collect a lot more diverse facets of common sense comparative knowledge. And this goes on to show that, yeah, perhaps when it comes to this kind of knowledge acquisition, language models are already doing fairly well and much better than humans in some sense. So we can rely on these language models. So yay for language models. Humans tend to not be, have as much coverage in the different facets we consider when we are comparing entities. So that's great. Okay, so moving on to a different kind of knowledge, we will now look at explanations. This work is led by my PhD student Brihi and is very much ongoing research. Here we try to ask this question, if we get explanations from language models, how well do they satisfy the kind of use cases we're looking for? How well do they satisfy this human utility for different kind of scenarios? So to give you a concrete example, say I have a question, why is obesity an issue in developed nations? And I'm pretty sure if I ask GPT, it will give me a very satisfactory answer. So we did something a little different than just as GPT. We asked it to assume that the explanation is intended for a particular role. So for instance, we asked it to assume that the explanation is intended for elementary school students. And we wanted to see if changing the role changed the type of explanation we got from GPT. So here it comes up, sorry, the text is a little too small because GPT tends to write a lot. But for elementary school students, it comes up with, an explanation that relates to sedentary work, energy imbalance, exposure to advertising for unhealthy foods. Now, I have no idea how well-versed elementary students might be in this kind of language. To me, it seems a little more complex, but let's say like a very smart, well-read elementary student can still make sense of this. And it is acceptable. Now, we changed the role to a PhD degree recipient, so someone who, already knows a lot about the world, maybe specifically in this field. And here, the language model is able to come up with like even more complex things such as obesogenic environment, passive entertainment options, which is not that too much of a scientific term, positive energy imbalance, vicious cycle, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, and it's a much longer explanation than I could show here, but it seems to be doing something different from what it shows from the elementary school. So you would assume that if it is an explanation for a high school student, and I was trying to find the best icon for a high school student. Maybe high school students go through a goth phase from my knowledge of American TV shows. So that's the icon I used. Apologies for that. But you would think that it is somewhere in between the two. And the explanation that we get from GPT is, it is more or less similar to this elementary school student. I mean, one explanation for why this is happening is because there cannot be too many different reasons, but we were hoping for somewhat simplistic a style for an elementary school explanation versus high school versus PhD. All right. So if you look at how we do for these different kind of roles, we compared with the default, which is like we don't give GPT any role, we just ask it to explain this. And then we also compare to retrievals, things that we can find on Google that people have written already independently of our query. And then the three roles I just described. So here what we see is that, first of all, we see that expected behavior in terms of things like length, number of syllables. And then there is this metric for text simplicity called the Flesch-Kincaid ease, where higher is easier. We see that the trends are more or less preserved. PhD is more complex than high school, more complex than elementary school. But what's interesting is that the default explanation tends to be fairly complex as well, which is what I've shown in gold there. And the one that you get from the web, which is hopefully human written explanations, are much simpler than all four of these options from GPT-4. So that's showing something of a difference in how language models explain things as opposed to we do. They probably come up with much harder explanations, and we have a bunch of other metrics based on which we compared this text simplicity. But something about these metrics is not entirely satisfactory. So if you look at concrete examples via circles, 360 degrees, you can see that the elementary and the high school student explanations are fairly similar, and they go into, it goes into like perhaps too much detail that is not necessary. Or maybe I should flip it and ask the audience if you think this is a good explanation from the point of view of an elementary school student, where they talk about ancient Babylonians who made a choice over 2,000 years ago, and you're talking about number system was base 60, 360 is a multiple of 60. Is this a good explanation for an elementary school student? I just wanted to get people's opinions.
I mean, what is the explanation? The Babylonians told us so, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's another aspect of it. So there are two different kinds of explanations. One is a functional explanation where you explain why this is the case for satisfying a certain function. And then there is it is because it is, this kind of describing the world kind of an explanation. And this definitely seems to be the second kind.
Both in this and the previous example, I probably would have switched the elementary school and high school explanations in both of these examples.
Yeah, exactly, right? So, I mean, there is, elementary is what, fifth grade, right? Fifth grade up till maybe a fifth grade student can follow this, very smart fifth grade student, but I would consider elementary school as like much younger, like maybe a second grade student. And this is too much for a second grade student. So to me, this seems a little too complex. And yeah, maybe you're right in that flipping the other is probably better. So the key thing that we are starting to see here, again, this is very preliminary, but we're seeing that language models may not follow these rules too faithfully, too closely. And so explanations that you get out of language models are fairly lengthy, complex. Maybe this is a GPT-4 only trend. We are yet to see other language models, but there's something going on here that is somewhat not satisfactory. All right.
Sorry, I just comment. So I think something that just as a suggestion is like, as you say, like when you say elementary school, even to us, it might be like, okay, first grade who doesn't know how to read, or fifth grade who is closer, for example, to sing. So maybe this study that maybe this is too much of a course description. That
sorry, I only use this for for this talk, but in the prompt we specify something like a second grader or a third grader, something along those lines. Good question. Yeah.
Do you consider a more Socratic kind of approach to question asking? Because it really, if you talk to a young child, you'd say, well, because the Babylonians told us so, and then say, well, why did they think that? And you'd say, well, actually, they'd look at the sun and it did this, and then they'd say, oh yeah, okay. And then, but then why 360? And so, it's not, it feels like this is not how we actually interface with knowledge. It's more of a dialogue, but here it kind of gets squashed into a very long explanation.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, this is a good point, right? Like asking it questions back. I think that's something we tend to do when the answers that we get are not like too long or elaborate, right? Like if it just says because it said so, and then you ask a question, and then there is a conversation. It's just the minute you ask this question, it just goes into like this whole explanation. But you have a good point in that, like perhaps we ask it to be as brief as possible and come up with a simple explanation and then engage in some kind of a conversation. Perhaps that is a better way in extracting the right kind of explanation for that level.
Or even describing the cognitive, resources that an elementary school or high school, because part of the reason we have the Socratic method is because there's like an informational buffer that we're kind of assuming, right? And so this overflows the buffer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's a very good point. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the language-oriented tasks. Here we look at how language models deal with tasks that say something about language itself. We look at ambiguity as a first instance of this linguistic property. And this is work that was presented last year and was led by Alyssa at UW. So when we often encounter ambiguous language, in human interactions. So the cat was lost after leaving the house. It is possible the cat itself was unable to find its way after leaving the house, or the cat was unable to be found by the humans. So the cat is totally okay, but humans were not able to find the cat after leaving the house. So it could have two different explanations. And what we need in this case is a paraphrase of the original statement to figure out exactly what was meant. And this is often the case in politics, where politicians say things like, oh, since I took office, Wisconsin now has the second highest health care ranking in the country. Now, did it happen just coincidentally, or did it happen because of the actions that you took? That is something left unclear, and this can be sometimes misleading, right? So paraphrases can help disambiguate this kind of ambiguity, or by providing a little different perspective or context. And so the next thing we want to look at is how language models can deal with ambiguity. Can they come up with good paraphrases? Can they distinguish the two different possible meanings, etc.? Okay, so to do this, the setup that we used was we used the ambiguous statement either in the premise or the hypothesis, where you have a premise. He always ignores his mother's advice to follow his own dreams, and the hypothesis in this case contains the paraphrase, it contains another claim. He follows his dreams, and if we ask a GPT for what kind of explanation or what kind of meaning this sentence has, and this is we have a different setup where we look at the first disambiguation, second disambiguation, and the third disambiguation, which is true, false, or inconclusive. Here, GPT does something kind of tricky, where it says he always ignores his mother's advice to follow his own dreams and therefore does follow his dreams. Then the claim is true. So it's not really picking the two ambiguous or disambiguations where, is the mother's advice to follow the dreams, or is the mother's advice to not follow the dreams? So GPT does something like, he follows his dreams and therefore does follow his dreams. Claim is true. It's kind of doing something tricky here. He always ignores his mother's advice to follow his own dreams and therefore does not follow his dreams. Then the claim is false. So this is also kind of like repeating that claim again and claiming false. So clearly not the best kind of behavior that we would accept or we would expect for disambiguation. We also ran this test where we tried to look at how good it is at recognizing disambiguations. So we have this template here where the ambiguous statement may mean D, or does not necessarily mean D, cannot mean D, and this can only mean D, and the correct answer will be true, true, false, false, and we only give it a point if it does not, contradict itself. It should all be consistent with the template. So here, compared to random performance, GPT-4 does much better, but it is still at 63 points, whereas humans do perfectly on this task. Humans won't do the self-contradiction, and you can see that weaker language models are somewhere in between random and GPT-4. So this seems to be a hard task for language models. Just figuring out what the different disambiguations are tends to be not easy. Now, you may say, okay, recognition is not something language models are known for. They are known for generating disambiguations. So just based on human judgment, how good are they in generating both kinds of disambiguation for an ambiguous statement? Here, again, compared to human, even GPT-4 is much, much worse at generating the right disambiguation. And we use different metrics. Obviously, the human judgment is the more reliable metric in this case. And we also look at edit F1 between the expected disambiguations and what it generated. So this is something humans still have an edge on. It's very easy for us to think of multiple meanings for ambiguous language, whereas language models are typically not suited for this goal. And you can think we have some kind of broad communicative intent, which shapes why we are good at disambiguating or paraphrasing when we recognize ambiguity, whereas language models do not necessarily have that same kind of communicative intent in the way that they are trained. And so perhaps there is a factor there. So the second kind of linguistic task we use for it is something that involves linguistic structure, and this is, semantic structure, where we look at events and the different roles played by different entities in the event, and this is again ongoing work. So here, say we have a sentence: the mix is baked for 20 minutes in molds and served with vegetable cream sauce, blah, blah, blah. What we asked GPT to do here is write a new sentence, which is as similar as possible, keeps the same semantic structure as the original sentence, but replace the verb baked with toasted, such that all the semantic roles in the given example are appropriately filled. And we gave it some, instructions on what these semantic roles mean, and the definition of what this absorb heat frame. This is a semantic frame under this formalism called FrameNet. We ask it to generate a new sentence. So it generates something like: the bread is toasted for 20 minutes in the oven and served with the same things. So how many of you think this is a good generation? Do you see anything wrong with it?
Oh, the bread and the mix.
I think that's fine, because you toast bread as opposed to yeah.
Is the problem that it might burn after 20 minutes?
Exactly. So there is a pragmatics thing that is going on here, which is not right. So it preserved the semantics more or less. It took care of this entity, duration, and container, but it changed it to a heat source. So that is one issue. And the second one is that it completely ruined the pragmatics, because nothing is baked for 20 minutes because it would burn. So it was able to do okay on this task. But for a different example, where we have a somewhat more complex sentence: Gonzalez, who had been ejected from the premises after an argument involving a former girlfriend, was alleged to have deliberately caused the fire by igniting gasoline within the club. Okay, so what we want to do is replace the verb eject with amputated, which has a similar kind of semantic frame, which is this removing frame. It's a removing event. And what GPT ended up generating is something wild. His leg, which had been amputated 2 weeks after an argument involving a former girlfriend, was alleged to have deliberately caused the fire, blah, blah. So again, it did the task, kept theme, kept time, but completely missed the pragmatics. No legs cause fire. And it just knows that amputation is often used with body parts. So perhaps it tried to do too much to make it fit into the sentence. And so this is the kind of behavior we see. So sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. So which brings to question whether or not it is understanding the world the same way that we do. And so to give you some concrete metrics, if we compare it with expert annotated sentence and we are looking for semantic fidelity, whether or not it preserved the original structure and human acceptability, we see that GPT doesn't do it gets like 70 or 72 compared to the perfect performance that humans have. But it's not very reliable. it can sometimes do the task well and sometimes not. So this semantic fidelity remains high, but this failure to preserve pragmatics is the bigger problem here. Any questions? Okay, so moving on to the last aspect of our understanding, we look at how well our language models suited to understanding key societal phenomena. And in this case, we are looking at homelessness and figuring out, can we make sense of large-scale conversations about homelessness using language models? And this is work that is led by my student Jaspreet. So say I take this post from X and give it to GPT, asking it questions, is this message toxic? What is the implication for this message? GPT can generate something that is fairly nuanced and, very wordy, perhaps, but it has it says something that I would more or less agree with. However, this is something that we can do for single conversations within a certain context or limited by a certain context window. What we want to do is take a huge Twitter dump and look at all the conversations on homelessness and have these language models summarize what might be going on in these conversations. So to do this, we came up with a fairly complex pipeline in collaboration with a lot of people from social work, where we came up with 9 different issue-specific frames, which follow broadly 3 different themes based on this Goffman's theory of stigma. This is way beyond our expertise. So this is folks from social work really helped us with this. And then what we tried to do is give the language model all this information on the frames and have it predict which of these 9 frames the tweet may satisfy. And this is like a multi-label classification task. We can do it using GPT. We can use it using a classification model and so on. So the first thing we saw that this happens to be a very, very laborious process for humans to do this kind of annotation task. It took us almost 8 months to get about 4,000 annotations. We came up with the different frames, etc. It was extremely laborious. So what we tried to do is use some prompting tricks with GPT-4 to help us with this task, and it would come up with these labels, and our human annotators would go and fix the problems. We focused on a precision fix as opposed to recall, because recall is the one that takes a lot of time. So we just wanted precise labels from this process. So this process helped us collect some more annotations, but more importantly, it really sped up our process. We were able to do this annotation in very little time. Perhaps another factor was that the deadline was near. So the process was very sped up. But overall, if we see how humans do versus how just GPT does, we see a little bit of a gap, not a ton of gap compared to the other tasks we see. But again, this is a very hard task. Even humans are not able to get perfect performance, given this is like a 9-way multi-label classification task. But with humans and GPT together, we are able to bridge that gap quite a bit. And if we train a model on this task, we are able to get fairly reasonable performance. So with some effort, these language models can be used as assistants for doing a first round of annotations, which can help us make sense of these complex social phenomena at scale. And once we have this data we got these labels on a ton of annotations. and we were able to, analyze the data that we have for the kind of, attitudes about homelessness we see on the West Coast versus the East Coast, or by different states where, in California, you see the prevalence of this NIMBY kind of an attitude, much more than you see in New York, etc. And we were able to also do some kind of time analysis, etc. So all of this was possible only because of language models. If we didn't have language models, we wouldn't be able to do any of this work. And this is currently my students are helping us build these tools that can be used for actual community organizers to enable better tools to understand public conversations and use that towards better interventions, which I think is really, really cool. And the fact that we couldn't do this without language models, couldn't have done any of this without language models, is saying how powerful this technology is. And so inspired by this, we also look at another kind of social task where we look at, can these language models be helpful in analyzing suicide reports towards designing novel interventions? So some of the material I'll show might be disturbing, but I've redacted most of the actual reports. So often in the text in suicide reports will contain details such as, interactions with non-clinical professionals, such as, family custody, child support, battle with child, or court-ordered rehabilitation orders, or in the process of a divorce or financial problems. So the idea here, and this is idea that we are pursuing in collaboration with the School of Public Health, where we are trying to see if these interactions or these reports contain any evidence of any direct or indirect evidence of interactions with non-clinical professionals, such that we can use this information towards designing better interventions. So for instance, if people or lawyers who interact with people going through divorces could be trained to, point their clients towards resources that can help them, avoid these, life-ending events. So since this is extremely sensitive information, we don't want humans to look at it, obviously. So here we thought that language models can be effective assistants in, figuring out where there are these interactions, and in a way such that we can collect evidence to design better interventions. So here, what we see is that compared to human performance, where we are looking at inter-annotator agreement, something like Llama 2 has still a big gap in understanding where there is an implicit interaction with, say, a lawyer. So there is still a little bit of a gap, but it is definitely something that we can use for designing these human-free systems that might be able to get us to the interventions we desire. So there is a non-trivial amount of hand-holding we need, and these are very initial results. This is still very ongoing work, but you can see that there are different kinds of interventions that we can design which do not involve any human input, and it might be a good use of language models. So putting it all together, going back to the two broad ideas, I talked about understanding language models through the mechanism and design and through the comparison with human behavior. Here, we see that there are lots of ways in which language models are very, very different from humans. And it's not that scale and data is everything that we need in finding out what the deficiencies of language models are. There might be other factors we need to consider, perhaps different training objectives, which are using environments similar to the environments that humans use to learn new things might be a factor in building the next generation of powerful language models. Specifically in comparison with the human behavior, we saw 3 different categories of tasks. In the knowledge-oriented side, we saw that they are able to match or exceed human capacity, but there seem to be some distinctive strengths, like language models can learn a lot of things, have a lot of knowledge, but explanations that they come up with based on that knowledge may or may not be suited to different roles. Language models struggle at nuanced linguistic skills. Unlike humans, we are very good at understanding and processing semantics, especially like very intuitive semantic structures, whereas language models do not really do the same. For societally oriented, it's somewhere in between, where they do have certain abilities, but we still need to do some specialization via designing these frameworks that allow them to do more social tasks. So again, all of this reveals as much about the nature of natural language as it reveals about the models and data. So one of my favorite papers of the last year is this generative AI paradox from AI2 and UW, where they show that even though the language model can generate something, it may not understand what it generated too well. So this goes on to saying that there is a mastery of surface form language, but generalization capabilities are not necessarily uniform. Robustness is an outstanding issue because you don't get reliable answers every time. And this is somewhat very distinct from humans. Humans are not as unreliable on average, but language models tend to be. So understanding these aspects of language models in comparison to what you see with the human is very important to making these language models better. And we cannot necessarily understand language models without considering the language in the language models and the overall utility and connection with human users. So that's all I have. Thank you. This is my lab, and I can take some questions.
Questions in the room on Zoom. I'm monitoring the chat.
It's end of semester and a Friday. I understand everyone's doing their best.
So there's one Zoom question from Hanley. Regarding your amputated wrist ejected amp example, the model, I believe, failed due to the abundance of examples in the training set where the word amputated is associated with a body part rather than the semantic meaning of simple removal. The model might have fared better if more information were available in the context. I'm wondering if the thought process is correct, if his thought process is correct, or if we can quantify the performance on the basis of the diversity of the training set.
Well, okay, so this is when we say training set, this is like the entire internet. So we are just doing prompting on GPT-4. It is true that probably it has seen a lot of examples of amputations of legs, but given that it has been trained on the entire internet, it should have seen other cases for amputation. And we tried different styles of prompting. We tried chain of thought prompting. We tried, simple zero-shot, one-shot prompting, and we didn't see that big of a difference in these different flavors of prompting. Which and that was just one example. We see this over and over again for multiple examples, and there are certain things that the language model is not able to do. And you're right in that, like, this is part of the training data, but that also brings to question this assumption that we have, like, if we give it all the data that we have, it should be able to do better. So it doesn't necessarily happen to be the case every time.
Yeah, what are some use cases of that corpus of comparative objects, since the large language models already have those knowledge?
Yeah, so when we started building that corpus, we didn't have language models such as GPT-4 at our disposal. It was a longish project. We started right before ChatGPT came out, actually. And at that time, the best language model we had was still GPT-2 XL, and we wanted to get the most out of GPT-2 by designing these constrained decoding algorithms that can still use GPT-2 to retrieve this comparative knowledge. But by the time we were done with that process, the larger GPTs came out. But still, we saw that, like, with the larger GPT models, you can, you need to do a lot of filtering, which for the smaller models, since we were doing constrained decoding, we didn't need to do as much filtering. So the whole purpose was to collect a knowledge base. And I mean, you could ask a question like, why do we do something like that now? And it's a good question. Maybe now it's less relevant than it used to be a few years ago. But the whole purpose of doing this effort was to show whether or not language models, small versus large, can do this task of comparative knowledge acquisition from the internet, or like based on what they have learned in pre-training.
Thank you.
I had a question about the softmax bottleneck formulation. That seems like a very interesting and very major problem for language models. And could you give us a teaser about, like, what next steps are you following about?
Matt was here last week, I think. Yeah, so another direct consequence of that softmax bottleneck is that we can use it to get information from these closed source language models about their hidden size, and maybe also retrieve like the last layer or some rotation of that last layer just by doing collecting these log probes and doing some SVD on top of it. I mean, some of that is, you can say like, oh, why do we care? We have like Llama 3 now, open source is amazing. But it matters because you are able to learn something about the model that can still hold it accountable. So what you see here is what we call this model image, which is the allowable set of probabilities that the model can take. And that seems to be very unique for every model. Even if you change the checkpoint, that image tends to change a lot. And so we use that as some notion of a model signature. So if we have access to that model signature, you can tell exactly which model an output came from. Now, it's not like in terms of the generation, but the actual log probabilities. So we're still figuring out how to take that and make connections with the data itself or with the generations itself. But it seems to be a powerful tool. Now, this is not necessarily the only tool that is available to us. And we came up with this. Actually, Matt came up with this before he started in my lab, based on something else he was looking at. But this tells us that there are so many other things about like these design decisions that language models have. I mean, you're looking at tokenization, and there are clues there, right, about things that could be improved that don't necessarily only look at data scale and parameter scale. So yeah, so the softmax bottleneck is definitely has been around for a while now, but it's very cool that we found these use cases for it. Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah, so in that user utility maximum, that's a study. So is there any way to actually like evaluate the
explanations?
Yeah, like whether they are appropriate for each group instead of just like say PhD, the explanation for PhD should be like more difficult to understand, like besides that?
Well, we're just looking at suitability. And this is, again, preliminary work right now. We are trying to ask humans, these comparative questions, which is more suitable as an elementary school answer, which is more suitable as a high school student answer, etc. I don't know if that's what you meant.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that your question? I don't know if I answered your question.
I was wondering, so is there some kind of like a metric to say, oh, this is a good answer for elementary school, by not comparing to PhD students or high school students?
So just absolute, that's what these metrics tend to get at. So this Flesch-Kincaid scale this has been around for a really long time. I think they came out in like maybe the 80s or something, where they look at multiple different metrics like the length of something, number of syllables, number of monosyllables, polysyllables, etc. And they come up with this regression that gives a score that tells you something about the ease of a particular text. This is an absolute metric. You're not looking at other
I know, but also I think this work can also be extended to other user groups instead of like different kind of students. Like, what about some other groups like where it's harder to define such to evaluate by how easy it is or how difficult it is, the generation. Like for example, different demographics or like that is harder to absolutely define some metric like this, right?
Yeah, so I mean, in that case, the best we can do is directly ask the demographics, like the groups of users, whether or not you found this useful. And I mean, you can say that all these interfaces try to do that by having like that little checkbox at the very end, was this useful or not? But I mean, to the extent that people actually use that checkbox or they just run with whatever they get. But you're right in that, like, as the roles change, you need different kinds of evaluation. To the best of, our knowledge, asking humans directly is the best way to do this. And even then, it's very hard. Like, I mean, we are obviously not going to recruit elementary school students for this task. We'll have to ask a human if this was the explanation provided to an elementary school student, would it be good? By that same token, for other demographic groups, like for instance, if you're looking at, let's say, non-native English speakers, then you would have to recruit someone like that versus native English speaker, and do these kinds of very targeted human evaluation. So this is like one example for us to measure human utility, but at the end of the day, this is what matters, right? Like, you can have any metric, but ultimately, if the human found it useful, then it's useful. So asking the humans directly, I think, is the cleanest way in which we can do this.
Thanks.